All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our May Charging Smart webinar. We today will be talking about EV messaging and communications. We have some new resources available for you, which we're really excited about, and I'm looking forward to this next hour. So thank you for joining us. We'll get started with our usual. Usual top of the hour agenda. We have our welcome and a few team updates to share with you all. Then we'll do a quick review of the education and incentives category, which aligns really well with this EV messaging and communications topic. And then I will pass it over to my colleague Jem to kind of share the bulk of the information about EV communications and messaging, followed up by some program reminders for you all, and then we'll have the last bit of our webinar today to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I would encourage you to you can be putting questions in the chat as we go, and we might answer them within the presentation, but we'll be sure to cover them at the end of of the call. But also, when we are in the question and answer portion, I would encourage anyone to, as you're able and comfortable, come off mute and ask any questions that you have for the whole group. I'm sure that if you have the question, others do as well. So it will be a benefit to all for you to voice that question. So as always, I see most of you have already done it, but if you wouldn't mind changing your Zoom name to include the community and the state that you're representing, can be really helpful for others to see who's on the call, and when you're asking those questions, to give some context from where you're at. And then also, if you've already changed your name, we always have a fun little icebreaker to put. You can type it in the chat. And today our question is, how have you been engaging with community members related to EVs and charging? So let us know in the chat. I think it could be a really great way for some other people on the call to get an idea from what you did. Or if you haven't quite done anything yet, that's okay. You could put something that you're maybe thinking or would like to do. So two options there. I'll give us all a moment. I see that there's some people jumping on, so I'll give you a moment to get settled and change your name in Zoom. That is done. Using the top, if you kind of move to your square and zoom, there's three little dots, an icon that shows up, and you can click on that and choose rename. But I see some information coming in the chat here. We have some communities that are doing social media and adding information into the city website, which is fabulous. We love to see that. Hosting ride and drive events and thinking about how to include EVs in a sustainability festival that's hosted. And I think that's a really great way. We don't have to have just an event about EVs. It can be kind of put into a larger event that covers a variety of different topics. And also, I'm seeing that the Ashland has worked with some partners to let's see, host some events and work groups regarding EV. So I think maybe you're beating me to my point later on in my presentation. I'll say, don't forget to talk about or think about the different partners that you could be working with. So I'm really pleased to see that that's already being done. Well, thank you all for your participation in that. I love to see the great work that's being done. Some updates from our GPI team is that Muntas Farah's last day was earlier this month. We sent out emails to the people that were up. This was kind of mostly impacting, but if you want to or need to contact the GPI team, please reach out to either Jem or myself for any charging smart questions or concerns that you might have. We're more than happy to help you in any way. And then also, while we're saying goodbye to Muntas, who will miss dearly, we do want to give a big welcome to Tyler, who is a fellow working with GPI for this summer. So a big welcome to Tyler. We're excited to have him on our team and get him settled. Yesterday was his first day. So we are looking forward to a great summer with Tyler. So with that, I'll move on to the review of the education and incentives category. And I am thrilled to be talking about this today because it is my favorite category out of all of the 6 categories that the Charging Smart program has. Uh, they're all great and wonderful, but I do really think that education is foundational for the rest of the work that we're doing. So this education incentives category really focuses on education and outreach to community members, local businesses, commercial property owners, and other groups within our community or who might be interacting with our community. It focuses on workforce development, which is a newer addition to this category, and I think it's a really great addition. As well as thinking about financial incentives that the municipality can provide to the different groups mentioned above. And this is all being done with the goal of increasing awareness of the technology and its benefits to our community, as well as promoting the different available rebates and incentives and opportunities, both that the city or municipality offers, but also other opportunities, whether that's at the state level or federal level, depending on what's available at the time. And then also just generating excitement and making EVs fun for our community members. Because when we have community support, I think maybe you all might know that it makes your job easier to do these different actions when there's support behind the work that we're doing. So within just a review of how the Charging Smart program is organized is that we have these categories, and then the categories are organized into best practices. And within those best practices, there's a variety of actions or criteria that you can complete for points. So in the education and incentives category, we have 6 best practices that are hosting events and campaigns around EVs, which from the icebreaker, it seems like all of you or many of you are already doing. Creating a spot on the municipal webpage devoted to information about EVs and charging, which check some of you have already done that, which is great. Providing education to commercial property owners about EVs and charging infrastructure, offering incentives for the installation of charging stations, and also offering financial incentives for purchasing EVs. And then, as I mentioned, our newest addition to this group is supporting local EV charging workforce development for charging infrastructure. So, we do have, because as I mentioned earlier, we view this education incentives category as really foundational for the work that we do. We do have requirements for to be designated as bronze. We have some requirements surrounding this education and incentives category. So of the 80 total points needed for bronze designation, 15 of those points do have to come from this category. The nice thing is that you can choose whichever actions in this category you want. We aren't requiring specific actions as we do in some cases. We just say you can choose how you want to do this. And so I think that's really nice for communities to be able to kind of have that menu of options and choose what fits best. And that's something I will say that if you're wondering about or need support on the GPI team, we're here to help you with that, think through it. But for this silver and gold designations, we don't have specific requirements because we think that we should be doing it at the beginning at that kind of bronze level, getting that foundation in. But that being said, you can still, if if there's actions that you still want to do in the education and incentives categories, which I encourage, you can still complete those actions and get points towards kind of the general points that are needed to be earned for the silver and gold designations that are on top of the 15 points that are required for bronze. So that being said, I came up with a couple different examples of different ways that you might be able to earn these points in the category for the bronze level designation. For instance, example one is saying you could create a web page on city or municipal site that's devoted to information about EVs and charging infrastructure. And on that webpage, if you promote the different EV programs and incentives that are available through the city or the electric utility, you could earn 15 points and kind of cross off that 15-point requirement for bronze. Another example of what you could do is perhaps you could host a ride and drive within your community and devote some information or devote some space, excuse me, in a newsletter or some other communication, in a newsletter or communication about EVs that goes out to your community or to commercial property owners or something like that. And you would get those 15 points. So there's a variety of different ways. I think the point of this slide is that you can kind of mix and match and choose what you will. And I see that many of you have already accomplished some of these actions. So you're well on your way to those 15 points, which we love to see. I also want to highlight that as I mentioned, we can help you decide what might work best. We can also provide you with resources and examples of what's already been done to help you through this. For instance, we have a ride and drive toolkit that can help you if that's something that you want to host, but you're not sure how to go about doing it. We have a great guide for how you can host a ride and drive event. Or we have a template for developing a website where you can just kind of copy, paste, and tailor the information to your community. So you're not having to create all of this information on your own. We have that for you. So wanted to highlight that as well so that this doesn't feel like it needs to be a huge lift, but could be really impactful for your community. The last thing that I'll say before passing it over to Jem is that as you're working on the education incentive categories actions, I really would encourage you to also be mindful of how we can be expanding the information and offerings that we're providing to folks to further enhance our efforts in this space. So for instance, as you're working through these actions, some things that you might consider are how can we be promoting multiple modes of transportation or different options for electrification. So perhaps in a ride and drive, you might also think about having e-bikes or e-scooters available to test out, or perhaps I've seen some that have different electrified lawn equipment available to see and hold at these events. Also, ensuring that your activity or manner of providing this information is welcoming and relevant to all community members, and maybe considering if it isn't right now, how could it be? And then also, as was fortuitously brought up earlier in our icebreaker, thinking about what collaborations you could have to further support the work that you're doing. That could be with the electric utility or with a university in your community or different community groups or places of worship. There's a whole host of different groups that we could be reaching out to or working with to support and enhance the work that you're wanting to do within your community. So sometimes that's you're already doing it, but it's a good reminder of some other things that we could be thinking about. And hopefully this has been a good reminder of the education incentives category and all the different actions within that category that we can be doing to educate our community members. And speaking of uh, educating our community members, part of that comes with EV messaging and communications. And so I will pass it over to my colleague Jem to talk more about that topic.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you for that overview of the education and incentives category. I think I agree, very important and impactful category, and is a really great transition into what I'm excited to talk about today, which is something we think a lot about here at GPI, which is the most effective way to craft messaging around EVs, both when discussing electrification and electric vehicles with community members, but also when discussing EVs with elected officials, decision makers, and key stakeholders. Next slide, please. And this is something we have been thinking about a lot recently as well, considering that EVs have kind of become a hot button political issue in an increasingly polarized environment. So, our thought is that the messaging surrounding EVs is becoming increasingly important, really wanting to find ways to highlight their benefits. Now, historically, as I'm sure we're most, or all of us are here are aware, one of the key points that's been emphasized when crafting messaging about electric vehicles has really emphasized sustainability. So the enhanced sustainability of EVs compared to their internal combustion engine counterparts. And we see this emphasis on sustainability really reflected in the Charging Smart program, and specifically the communities that are participating, kind of their points of contact very often have sustainability in their title or are housed within a sustainability department. I might be talking about a lot of the folks on the call here today. And for a lot of communities, that argument on behalf of EVs, that sustainability argument, is more than enough to inspire real action, to get communities to take steps to support transportation electrification and to really encourage EV adoption. But that is not necessarily the case for all communities. I might be describing your community when I say that, the sustainability narrative is compelling enough to cause real action. But for many communities, there are competing priorities that ultimately might take precedent over sustainability initiatives. And as part of Charging Smart and GPI in general, we really believe that the benefits of transportation electrification should be shared by all communities. So this has really highlighted the need to be able to demonstrate the usefulness of electric vehicles beyond purely the sustainability narrative. I think this is also very important and relates to what Rebecca was touching on about the developing of partnerships, both with community organizations and even within local governmental staff, looking across departments within your community to see where EVs can really provide multiple benefits. Next slide, please. Now, it was this recognition that led us to develop our most recent resource, which is our Electric Vehicle Messaging and for Elected Officials and Key Decision Makers Guide. This guide will be made available to everyone on the call in our follow-up email. And really, what this guide is intended as is a quick reference resource that helps community members, city staff members, and generally EV champions tailor specific messaging to specific audience that is relevant in the local context. Really, what this guide is trying to do is highlight the benefits of EVs beyond sustainability. Again, not trying to downplay the importance of EVs in sustainability initiatives, but also really highlighting the co-benefits of EVs, that they can help achieve sustainability goals and other priorities within a community. So that's the other core element of this resource, is aligning the benefits of EVs with those other community priorities. Next slide, please. Now, within this guide, what we have are specific messages or messaging techniques that, again, relate the benefits of EVs to potential community priorities. And these include economic development, community health, tourism, and community fiscal responsibility. So essentially, how can promoting and supporting and adopting electric vehicles and transportation electrification also help communities to achieve goals that are associated with these categories? Next slide, please. So, in addition to those specific messages that we'll be touching on in just a moment, within this guide, there are also resources, data points, and real world community examples that each are intended to support the message that is being presented, giving users of this guide the ability to point to hard data, to point to real communities in the real world, and demonstrate the benefits of EVs within their respective category. We also, at the end of the guide, have included a frequently asked questions section about electric vehicles, really focusing on the common barriers to adoption, both at the community level as well as the individual level. Next slide, please. Now, we're not going to be touching on each and every one of the messages and messaging elements within the guide today, but we did want to pull out a couple of specific examples just to give folks an idea of how the guide is laid out and how it can be most effectively used. So, starting off, looking at the messaging that's included within the section of electric vehicles and economic development. So, in this section, we have a handful of different messaging strategies that ties electric vehicles to things like how they can help create jobs within a local community. Also, how the widespread adoption of electric vehicles can increase discretionary income within communities because of the reduced cost of ownership compared to gas-powered vehicles. Also showing how electric vehicles and their charging infrastructure can really support local businesses, especially when co-located with EV chargers. And then lastly, how creating a policy environment that is friendly to transportation electrification can really help in attracting private investment. Next slide, please. Now, here is an example of one of the messaging sections from the guide itself. And this one having to do specifically with EVs and how they can relate to job creation within the community. So you see at the top here, the message being, supporting the transition to EVs in our community will create new, high-paying local jobs in manufacturing, charger installation, grid upgrades, and related industries. Now, these messages throughout the guide could be used verbatim. We do encourage community members, city staff members to also feel free to tailor them to be more applicable to your local context. But that being said, we did try to make these fairly general so that they are widely applicable. And underneath each of the different messages within this guide, you then get a section that highlights what sort of communities might this messaging be most effective in. So in the case of EV job creation, I think you have your general case of communities that are seeking to create new high-paying jobs within their local economy, but also communities that maybe have a large industrial manufacturing capacity or are looking to expand that manufacturing capacity. This sort of messaging might be appropriate. Now, under this section within each of the different messages, we then have our rationale and fast facts section, as well as real world examples. So in this case, our rationale and fast facts, we're linking to multiple reports and studies demonstrating both the current and projected future job growth associated with the electric vehicle industry and transportation electrification in general. And then also, we provide this example here of when the Commonwealth of Virginia had estimated that transportation electrification, their current efforts, would create between 275,000 and 291,000 jobs over the course of 10 years. So if you're imagining a user of this guide being able to present this messaging and then point to a real world example of work that's being done and how that is creating local jobs, as well as these multiple studies demonstrating how supporting transportation electrification is leading to the creation of many new jobs, all can be in support of that original message that was laid out at the beginning. Now, up to our next slide. Now, this next example I wanted to highlight is regarding how EV-ready communities can attract private investment. Now, a little bit of background before I dive into this one in particular, because this is actually something that's been coming up a lot recently. A lot of communities that we work with were either waiting on or expecting federal funds that have either been frozen or paused right now. And so this has become a real question for a lot of communities. How do we pay for some of this infrastructure? And if we can't pay for it, what's the next best thing that we can do if the funding at the federal level is kind of suspect at the time? We've also heard from our private sector clients, or not client, private sector partners on Charging Smart who helped to develop the program, that they are really looking for communities that have a policy environment that is friendly to electric vehicles and electrification as kind of the key places they would like to invest in and deploy chargers in. So this knowledge, this little bit of background, was really part of why we included this particular messaging element, which the message reads, with less support and funding for EVs at the federal level, private investment will be a key driver of EV infrastructure deployment. If we develop a policy environment that supports EVs and EV charging, we will be especially competitive locations to receive this private investment. So, you can already probably imagine this messaging could be fairly effective for a lot of communities who are maybe expecting that federal funding to help provide EV charging infrastructure, who are now trying to figure out what their next steps might be. And those are the sort of communities that this messaging might be most impactful for. And then in terms of the rationale and fast facts we provide here, multiple examples of some of the large entities that are currently deploying electric vehicle charging infrastructure and their plans to really expand these networks over the coming years. We can hop to our next slide. Now, somewhat related to economic development would be EVs and tourism. We did want to pull this particular element out and have its own category because we do think there are a lot of communities where this sort of messaging could resonate. And in this section of our guide, we really highlight how EVs can support tourism and local economies in a variety of ways. Things like EV charging stations as a roadside amenity, bringing people into a community to patronize local establishments, EV charging stations at tourist destinations, so supporting tourists traveling to those destinations. Then also the use of EVs and being an EV-friendly community as a way to enhance a community's ecotourism branding. And then lastly, how electrification can also support increasingly electrified recreational activities. Next slide, please. Now, this example we've pulled here having to do with EV charging stations at tourist destinations, and the message being, tourists will increasingly be traveling by electric vehicle. If we do not have the infrastructure to support this shift, we risk the long-term success of our tourism industry. Now, this messaging is most likely to be effective in communities that already have a large tourism industry or those that are hoping to become more of a tourist destination. In our rationale and fast facts, we really highlight the growth of the EV market and highlighting that increasingly travelers will be likely to be arriving by EVs. And then in our real world examples, we have a couple of great ones. A destination marketing organization, Visit North Carolina, worked directly with their local DOT to identify locations for EV charging stations that would help to support and attract tourists. And then Visit Arizona, another destination marketing organization, has also created an EV tourism page on their website, which helps to provide route planning resources, charging locations, and other resources for their visitors who are arriving by electric vehicle. Next slide, please. Now, another one that maybe is not at the top of mind for most folks, I know it wasn't for some of ourselves when we were first diving into this work, but electrified recreation is one that is seemingly increasing momentum and could provide a lot of great co-benefits, especially in the tourism category. So the messaging we've developed here is many forms of recreation are becoming electrified, including all-terrain vehicles or ATVs, bikes, and recreational vehicles or RVs. If we don't have the necessary infrastructure to support these electrified recreational vehicles, we risk losing visitors and the money they would spend in our community. Now, this would be most appropriate for communities where there are already large industries around recreational opportunities that are going to become increasingly electrified, but also rural communities where electric mobility devices like electric ATVs and golf carts are used for day-to-day transportation. Our rationale and fast facts here really highlighting the growth of the electrified recreational vehicle market, looking at ATVs and their growth over the coming decade, as well as e-bikes and their growth, both currently and projected out into the future. And then again, some real world examples. We think that being able to provide these real world examples really helps, especially key decision makers, see that there is a proof of concept. And so in this case, we highlight how in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, there's already an off road trail charging network specifically for electric ATVs and snowmobiles being developed. So recognizing that more and more people will be arriving using these electrified versions of these recreational vehicles and wanting to have the infrastructure there to support that industry. Next slide, please. Now, another key category within the guide is how electric vehicles can support community health initiatives or improve community health, and primarily through the improvement of air quality for residents and visitors because of the zero tailpipe emissions of electric vehicles, and through the reduction of noise pollution. Next slide, please. Now, one that I'll highlight here is electric vehicles and their zero tailpipe emissions, the messaging being widespread adoption of electric vehicles will improve the air quality for our residents. Children in our community deserve to breathe fresh and clean air. And of course, this may be somewhat self-explanatory, but the communities where this could be most impactful, communities where public health is already a concern or priority, as well as those that are suffering from poor air quality, perhaps associated with being near a major roadway. Then here in our rationale and fast facts, really highlighting both research that demonstrates the adverse effects of particulate matter and pollutants associated with internal combustion engines on public health, as well as some resources that demonstrate what the what sort of health impacts would be prevented with the widespread adoption of electric vehicles. Again, I think all very powerful talking points, especially when speaking with key decision makers and elected officials. I think this is a nonpartisan issue. Everyone wants to have healthy communities and be able to breathe fresh air. You can hop to the next slide. Now, another category that we wanted to highlight is how electric vehicles can enhance a community's fiscal responsibility, and primarily because of the reduced costs when operating electric municipal fleets, then also through the increased revenue, especially when cities have a municipally owned public utility. Next slide, please. Now, one of the examples I'll touch on here, fairly simple messaging. Our community will see significant savings by converting our municipal fleet to EVs. Again, fairly simple messaging, which is supported by our rationale and fast facts, where we've got research that shows that across the US, state and local governments could save around $10 billion in lifetime cost of ownership just by replacing current fleet vehicles, and that the total cost of ownership for EVs is about 10% less than gas-powered vehicles, and that's even after you factor in installing charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, we did also decide to include a frequently asked questions section within this guide, and this is really geared towards both barriers to electric vehicle adoption and supporting electric vehicles at both the community level as well as the individual level. And we'll be the first to acknowledge that there is no shortage of frequently asked question documents out there relating to electric vehicles. But we felt it was important to provide as up-to-date version of one as we could, because some of the key barriers to adoption of EVs that were, really major considerations even a couple of years ago are becoming increasingly less so because of the development of new technologies, advancements in the types of EVs that are on the road, things like range anxiety, charging speed, operations in extreme weather, all still considerations and potential barriers, but much less so than they once were because of the advances in electric vehicle technology. So our frequently asked questions section is laid out as you can see here, where you have the question itself, a response, and then several links to resources that again help to support the response to the frequently asked question. Now to the next slide, please. Now, before we move into some of our program updates, I did want to just touch on a couple of additional considerations with this guide itself, which, as I mentioned, will be available to all on the call and any participants in Charging Smart. And that is to make sure if you've got the ability and the inclination to try to adapt the messaging we've provided to more accurately reflect local context and priorities. Like I mentioned at the beginning, these are fairly general statements in our messaging document that could be easily adapted to be much more relevant to your local circumstances. So this should not be seen as a finished product in terms of the messages, but really a starting point so that users can then take this resource and make it even more compelling within their local community. Also, really important to remember is that different communities are going to have different priorities. I'm sure I'm just preaching to the choir on this one, but understanding these priorities is going to be key in determining the most effective messaging techniques. Also important to remember that the most effective messaging could differ by audience, even within the same community. Whether you're talking with an elected official, a city staff member, or just a resident of your community, the most appropriate and effective messaging technique will likely differ. So understanding your audience always going to be important in both EVs and any messaging opportunity. And also, there's no reason why you couldn't use multiple of the messaging strategies laid out in this document. In fact, every community has multiple things that are very important to them. So being able to tie EVs as a solution to multiple issues that a community is facing really only makes the argument for EVs that much stronger. And if you are part of a sustainability department, this gives an opportunity to create partnerships with other entities, both outside of your municipal government as well as within. With that, before we open the floor up to Q&A, I did want to just touch on a couple of quick program reminders for everyone. First being, I'm sure folks are aware as participants in the program, but perhaps the most important resource at our disposal is our program guide. Folks should hopefully have the most up-to-date version of our program guide at their disposal, but if not, we are happy to provide that, and it will also be linked here in this slide deck that will be distributed after this webinar. Within this, the program guide, there are very detailed explanations of each criteria and each action, as well as a description of the verification documents that will be required to demonstrate that those actions have been completed. Each action also has a great variety of resources and community examples. We always say that if you're having trouble with a particular criteria or particular action, in addition to reaching out to your technical assistance providers like ourselves, we always say go ahead and read the program guide, that particular section, because between the detailed explanation and the resources and community examples, there is just so much great information there that can hopefully clear the way and make it more apparent what is expected of a community participating in the program. Next slide, please. Also, folks may already be aware, but we are now using a bookings link for scheduling one-on-one meetings with the GPI staff to provide technical assistance. Again, that link will be included in this slide deck that will be distributed today. Should also be included in the follow-up email that will come out. If you have a particular GPI staff member who has been providing your technical assistance, there will be a drop-down menu where you can select that staff person, and it will then display their available times, and you can schedule a meeting. And if you don't have a specific TA provider that you've been working with, or you're just looking to get the soonest possible appointment, you don't have to select any specific GPI staff person. You can leave that blank, I believe, and it will essentially draw from all of our availabilities, and you can schedule with the next available GPI staff member. And with that, do want to open the floor to questions, both on the education and incentives category, messaging around EVs, and really any other questions that might have come up throughout today's presentation.
Thank you, Jim. That was wonderful. We do have a few questions that have come up in the chat while you were speaking, so I'll just vocalize those, and everyone else you can be thinking about your questions that you have. The first one is from Erica at Oakwood Village in Ohio, and she's wondering about with entities like NOPEC who offer a grant to their members, what type of messaging would you use to increase the annual stipend amount to be able to cover EV chargers?
I mean, yeah, great question. And I think that gets at a question a lot of communities are having right now. How do we fund this, especially given what we were discussing a little bit earlier, just some of the federal funding opportunities being less secure or less certain than they were maybe even a year ago. Um, so I guess without knowing the specifics of, I'm sorry, it was of NOPEC. They may have specific criteria specific to NOPEC that would kind of dictate the annual stipend amount in terms of covering EV chargers. But that being said, I think relating the benefits of EVs to multiple community benefits is always going to be a strong start, demonstrating again that this EVs and transportation electrification is a tool that can address and solve multiple priorities within a community. Would be, my first thought in terms of creating a even more compelling narrative as to why additional funding should be provided for the development and installation of chargers. But without, I think more of the specifics of what NOPEC is looking for. I don't know if I can get more detailed than that, but I see Rebecca might have something to
Well, I was
contribute.
also thinking, Jen, perhaps you had a slide about the private investment and maybe tailoring some of that information to saying, without there used to be more federal funding available and that's no longer available. And we think it would be really good for other groups to step up and provide this, provide funding. And perhaps that could be kind of an avenue to talk with NOPEC about increasing that stipend. Erica also had a question. I think I'll verbalize it, but we'll jump on and maybe if other people on the call have some thoughts for Erica about this question, put it in the chat. We'll come back to it. There was one other question specific to the messaging, and then we'll come back to that one, Erica. But Erica was wondering about they're trying to determine if EV infrastructure would be best for just being available to their municipal
Mhm.
fleets or if they should open it up to the community as a whole. So if you are a community that has charging infrastructure, whether it's for just your municipal fleet or or if you've opened it up for public use, if you wouldn't mind making note of that in the chat and providing Erica with some thoughts on maybe how you got to that decision. But then I wanted to move on to the next question about messaging that is, does the guide have any information on how to support how EVs support union jobs?
Mhm. It does not specifically touch on the UAW and union jobs specifically. I think that is a great example of an opportunity where some of the messaging could then be taken from the guide and adapted, kind of using some of that messaging in the economic development area, especially around job creation, as a starting point, but then seeking out more localized examples or more localized data sources, kind of relating that to specifically union jobs. I think that it would be a really compelling narrative, absolutely. I think that in developing this resource, it we didn't want to get hyper detailed or hyper specific, recognizing that obviously in your location, unionized jobs and the UAW, major entity, a major driver of employment, I would imagine, but maybe not the case for a lot of other communities. So we didn't want to get that specific in the development of the messaging items. But again, highly encourage folks to take what does work from this document and adapt it to their local context and kind of, add flavor as needed, add more of that local context in there, which I think only makes the messaging that much more effective.
Great, thank you. Well, are there other questions that people have about this messaging document? Or if not, we can open it up to, I see there's some conversation going on in the chat, more focused on charging infrastructure installment, which is wonderful as well. Hearing none. Ryan, I don't know if you're in a situation where you can come off mute, but maybe would you mind coming off mute and giving a bit more information about uh, the installations that you're doing?
Sure. So we had a public-private partnership through State Electric, which is a subsidiary of General Motors. So we're fortunate in the fact that we're a pretty major industrial city and have a very considerably large industrial corridor. And so partnering with GM was, I don't want to say no brainer, but they were much more willing to partner with us because we had more money to bring to the table as well. But with the private public partnership, 17 charging stations are being installed this summer. I think they're currently installing some of them. We have them at our community center, several parks. City Hall will have one. So essentially it's 17 poles with 2 plugs each. So the math would be what, 34 chargers total that would be publicly available. This was a project, I will say, it was multiple years in the making, and I wasn't really involved with the early part of the process, so I may not be able to answer all questions. There was like a significant stall. Originally, this was supposed to be completed in first quarter of 2023. The reason for the stall on their end was because basically there was a disagreement between State Electric and GM on how to handle funding on their end. But thankfully that's been resolved, and the chargers are currently being installed just, 2 years late.
I suppose better late than never, but that's really exciting news. And Ryan, can you remind me, does Sterling Heights, do you have any charging infrastructure that's specifically for your municipal fleet?
We do as well. So only 1% of our fleet is electrified at this point, so we don't have a huge demand, unfortunately, for EV charging so far. But we do have some private chargers behind our, I believe they're behind our police station, which is interesting because our main fleet's stored at DPW, but the vehicles that are utilizing the electricity tend to be used at the City Hall campus. So the police station was a good location to locate them. And they're in a gated off area, so they're not really accessible to the public in that way.
Sure. Yeah, well, and maybe Erica, that's making me think, Ryan, that's a good point about when you are considering if your chargers should be open to the public or not. Thinking about the location where they are is important. If it's someplace where your municipal fleet is kind of outside of where the general public is normally allowed, perhaps then it wouldn't be great to have that charging station be open to the public. But perhaps if all of the city fleet is at the city hall, or in your case, the village, you and that's where the chargers are anyways. Perhaps if you just have one or two vehicles that are electrified right now, it could be a good opportunity to also have other charging happening, and then maybe closing it off if once you get more vehicles and you need to be keeping your vehicles charged. But so maybe thinking about the number of vehicles that are being charged, the location of where you might want those chargers to be could help.
I just dropped my email in the chat. Well, by my email, I mean our sustainability office's email,
Sure.
sustainability@sterlingheights.gov. If anybody has more questions about our specific project, Alexis Richards, who couldn't be, or sorry, she just got married. She's Alexis Weinberg now.
Oh,
She couldn't be here physically in the meeting, but she was the one who was involved in those earlier stages. So any better clarifying questions, email that email. It'll go to both of us, and we'll be able to help. But I do need to hop off for another engagement. So thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate you guys.
yeah. Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you all to everyone else. Are there other questions or comments that people have about how they made the decision to have their charging infrastructure be public or reserved for their fleet vehicles? Hearing none, that's okay. If something does come up, um, as I've said multiple times, feel free to reach out to us or use that bookings link, which I'll send out in our follow-up email to schedule a meeting with us. I will make one other note about the bookings is that if you do have a specific topic that you want to speak on, it's really helpful. There's a spot where you can say what that topic is. It just helps us prepare for the meeting so that we can come to it with all the resources and information that we have to provide you and make the meeting as helpful and efficient and useful as possible to you. That being said, these are our emails. If you need them, feel free to reach out. I will note that Mackenzie Love is still on maternity leave, so it's better for right now to reach out to myself or Jem. But thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll give you a few moments back of your time on this. I think it's Wednesday. I'm off because of the long weekend. But thank you so much for coming, and keep an eye out for that follow-up email to come that has links to all of the different resources that we discussed today.